Move over, Cats, because there's a new wrestler making her debut in Chaldea soon. Hello everyone, Soberoni of G&A Reviews here, and I hope you've all been practicing your German suplex, because today we've got a servant spotlight for the grappling goddess herself, Astraea, aka Luvia. We'll be examining her stats and skills, as well as going over pointers on how to utilize her effectively, and an overall grade, comparing her to how she stacks up to the other 4-star servants. So if you're ready to step into the ring with Luvia, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and ring my bell so that you can catch all of these spotlight videos as they go up, and you can also help out the channel. But for now, on to Luvia's stats. Luvia has a max HP of 11,531 and a max attack of 9,734, which becomes 10,707 due to her ruler class modifier. There aren't many 4-star rulers to compare her to, but Luvia does have both the highest attack and HP among that group. She also has considerably high attack for a 4-star servant overall, however her HP is just about average for a 4-star. When it comes to her command cards, Luvia has 3 hits on her quick card, 4 hits on her arts, 1 hit on her buster, and 5 hits on her extra card. She has an NP gain rate of 0.43% and a star rate of 9.9%. Overall, Luvia has some very good offensive stats without much lacking in HP either, although she does only have average NP gain due to her low NP gain rate, and her star generating is fairly poor due to only having 1 quick card. Taking a look at her skills, Luvia's first skill is Protection of the Libra, rank A+. This skill increases an ally's attack, defense, and NP gain rate for 3 turns between 10 to 20%, all depending on level. Her second skill is Mana Burst Star, rank A+. This skill increases her own arts card effectiveness for 1 turn between 20 and 30%, and it grants her between 10 to 30 crit stars, both depending on level. And finally, her last skill is Judgment of the Stars, rank A. This skill costs 5 crit stars to activate as a demerit, but in exchange it will increase her star absorb between 300 and 500% for a turn, and also increase her crit damage between 30 and 50% for a turn, both depending on level. In addition, it will also charge her Noble Phantasm gauge by 20%. As for her passives, Luvia has Independent Action, rank A, which increases her crit damage by 10%, Territory Creation, rank A, which increases her arch card effectiveness by 10%, and Goddess's Essence, rank B, which increases her own damage by 225, and increases her debuff resist by 22.5%. Moving on to her deck and Noble Phantasm, Luvia has an Arts Buster deck with Quick, Arts, Buster, Buster, and an Arts Noble Phantasm. Her Noble Phantasm is Custis Morum. It deals damage to a single enemy with between a 900 and 1500% damage modifier, depending on level. It also grants Luvia 20 crit stars, and it deals additional bonus damage to enemies with an evil alignment, with a modifier between 150 and 200%, depending on overcharge. This Noble Phantasm can be strengthened through an interlude, which will increase the damage modifier to between 1200% and 1800% depending on level, and it also grants the Noble Phantasm Invincibility Pierce. On the brighter side of things, as a ruler, Luvia's Ascension mat requirements are very simplistic. For Ascension, she just requires 4 of each monument and piece from every class, while for skill leveling, she needs blue, red, and yellow gems from each class, as well as 10 Aurora Steel and 12 mirrors. Aurora Steel can be farmed at the Castle of Snow and Ice in Lost Belt 2 with a 39% drop rate, and mirrors have a 12% drop rate at the Rear Mountain in Shimosa. Don't make the mistake of thinking that Luvia's toned body is just for show, because much like Ruler Martha, despite being a part of FGO's best defensive class, Luvia chooses violence. Her attack is fairly high for a 4-star servant, and she benefits from a generous class damage modifier. Likewise, despite having only average HP, she is much tankier than most servants due to her class only taking half damage from most enemies. So on the whole, Luvia has some terrific stats. Just about the only places that she suffers are her star generating and her NP gain, but even those are areas that are massively improved through Luvia's flexible skill set. Passively, Luvia's Noble Phantasm gain benefits greatly from her high-ranking territory creation, but she can also boost her arts cards even further through her second skill, Mana Burst Star, which grants her a 30% buff to arts cards and generates 30 crit stars. The 30% buff only lasts for a single turn, so it may seem weak at first glance, but keep in mind that it does stack with territory creation, which makes it a much better 40% arts buff. And while the average mana burst may be 50%, Luvia exchanges that missing 10% for an additional 30 crit stars, which is more than worth it. Because more often than not, that's going to be enough stars to guarantee a crit from Luvia, which can further help her with both DPS and NP gain. And if that setup isn't enough, Luvia can also combine her mana burst with her third skill, Judgment of the Stars, which consumes 5 crit stars in exchange for massively buffing Luvia's Star Absorb and crit damage, and also charging her NP gauge by 20%. Considering that Luvia can produce so many stars instantly through her mana burst, the cost of activating this skill is nearly non-existent, and this skill makes it so that after popping Luvia's mana burst, she doesn't have to worry about RNG messing with her crit chances. This skill makes Luvia a lot less RNG dependent than most of the other crit DPS servants out there. Not only that, but the NP charge is good as well, and can even make it easy for Luvia to loop her Noble Phantasm on back-to-back turns. This skill also has a phenomenally low 4-turn cooldown, so it's quite abusable. Finally, Luvia has her most versatile skill in Protection of the Libra. This is a targetable skill that buffs an ally's attack, defense, and NP gain by 20%. The buffs themselves aren't game-changing, but given the skill's short cooldown and high uptime, they can be very beneficial to nearly any offensive servant for longer battles. Of course, Luvia can also target herself with this skill, in which case it becomes much more valuable, since the extra buff to defense works very well with her own ruler class to make her extraordinarily tanky, while the buff to her attack and NP gain stack with her arts buff, which means that she's going to hit noticeably harder and gain much more NP. For skill leveling priority, all of Luvia's skills are so strong that you can really justify leveling them in any order without much downside. However, I would recommend maxing Mana Burst first for the biggest increase in damage, followed by Protection of Libra for more consistency, and then her crit skill last since the NP charge doesn't scale with level. Luvia's Noble Phantasm is just as oppressive as her skills. It deals heavy damage to a single enemy, with additional damage to enemies who happen to have an evil alignment, and it also generates 20 crit stars. Furthermore, it receives a buff in about a year and a half that increases its base damage, and also gives it Invincibility Pierce. This is a tremendously strong Noble Phantasm for several reasons. Firstly, it's an Arts Noble Phantasm with 8 hits, which means that it refunds a lot of NP charge. Secondly, it deals a ton of bonus damage to many enemies, as a lot of servants have the evil trait, and it's a very common trait, particularly among enemies that appear as bosses in events and in story quests. Thirdly, it's a free 20 crit stars on a crit DPS. And fourthly, it eventually gains Invincibility Pierce, which means that most enemies have no way of dodging it, even in challenge quests. Now add on to that Luvia can easily spam and loop this NP due to her plethora of arts and NP gain buffs. Simply put, Luvia's NP damage and utility is nearly unrivaled. She has one of the strongest single target Noble Phantasms in the game, even among 5 stars, especially when you factor in her anti-evil damage, which makes her one of the best boss killers in the game as well. And between her mana burst and her ability to spam her Noble Phantasm constantly, she never has a shortage of crit stars to draw from using her third skill, which also makes her one of the most consistent and self-sufficient crit DPS servants as well. And even outside of her Noble Phantasm and her crits, her high uptime attack buff and powerful territory creation ensure that her arts cards are also some of the most efficient and hardest hitting around. In other words, Luvia is an offensive juggernaut who excels at damage at every level. Defensively, she also benefits from her class, by receiving half damage from most enemies, so she rarely has to worry about being killed too quickly or about any bad matchups. In fact, because of her class, she can be brought into nearly any battle and against nearly every boss, which makes her incredibly versatile and a safe bet to build around for any situation. Ironically though, her class is also one of her biggest weaknesses, since as a ruler, she doesn't have class advantage in most situations, which does hamper her DPS. She also lacks any hard defensive skills, so while she can be hard to take down conventionally, she is still susceptible to being one-shot by some enemy NPs. Luvia is your typical Arts DPS, so when it comes to team comp, it's best to pair her with supports who can enable her NP spam through NP charge skills or through arch card buffs, like Ryoma, Tamamo, and Helena. All three provide direct NP charge as well as powerful arch buffs that help Luvia spam out her Noble Phantasm. She can also be paired with servants who provide crit buffs and star generating if you want to maximize her crit damage. Servants like Mozart, Caster Gil, and Lan Ling. Gil and Mozart are excellent star generators who also pack powerful arch buffs, while Lan Ling has a very strong crit buff as well as an NP charge and an arch buff for Luvia as well. Luvia's Bondcraft Essence is Scale of the Stars. It buffs the party's arch card effectiveness by 10% and their crit damage by 15%. The effects aren't bad, but given Luvia's role as a DPS, you're better off using craft essences that bolster her arch card effectiveness and her NP damage, like Royal Icing, Black Grail, Painting Summer, and Sign of a Smiling Face, all of which will help maximize Luvia's NP damage. For a crit strategy, go with craft essences that bolster crit damage, like Knight's Pride, Another Ending, Sailor in White, and Talk on the Hot Sands. Knight's Pride can be especially effective since the demerit can be nullified by Luvia's class advantage and her defense buff. In the future, I recommend using Welcome Bunny if you can get it this summer, because it boosts arch card effectiveness and crit damage, as well as generates stars. So it's a perfect fit for Luvia. For command codes, Gakyo no Ufude is a good choice for Luvia's arch cards, since it does improve crit damage even further. Overall, Luvia is an exceptionally strong offensive arch servant. She has enough damage steroids in her kit to give her one of the strongest NPs around. Her NP gain is good enough to enable her to spam and loop said broken Noble Phantasm, and as a crit DPS, she is nearly unrivaled in terms of consistency and self-sufficiency. She also benefits tremendously from the defensive nature of her class, which makes her much tankier than most other offensive servants. The class is a double-edged sword, however, as the lack of class advantage does hurt her damage output, and her lack of a hard defensive skill prevents her from being a true tank. All of that said though, Luvia gets an S from me. She's just overpowered, especially for a 4-star. Her Noble Phantasm does much more damage than it has any right to do even without class advantage, and she's tailor-made to excel in all types of arts teams and boss fights. In my opinion, there is no better single target arch servant at the 4-star rarity. And those are my thoughts on Luvia. Someone at DW must be a huge fan of hers, because this is one of those servants where it really feels like they went out of their way to make her as OP as possible. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and consider subscribing if you really enjoyed the video. Join the party over at our Discord, chill with us on Twitch, and follow us on Twitter. And I'll see you all in the next Servant Spotlight. Soberoni out. Later.